Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week we are speaking with one of my very good friends and maybe seventh favourite guest, the one and only Christopher Knowles of the Secret Sun. Now, if you haven't seen Alien Covenant, our discussion will inevitably spoil it. At least from a plot surprise perspective. But what I would point out is that it is actually very difficult to spoil the plot of an Alien film, because if you think about it, you already know what's going to happen. That's one of the upsides and downsides of a monster movie. The other side of the coin is our discussion might just unspoil it, if you are prepared to give up a little plot surprise for some additional context going in, especially as this episode roams far and wide over the presence of ancient alien theory, or AAT, in popular culture. It is a fantastic chat. Enjoy. Mr. Knowles, welcome back.
Oh, it's great to be here. Always great to be here.
Nice one. Well, let's get this out of the way. You saw a film this weekend. So, Chris, Alien Covenant, what did you think?
Incredibly disappointed. I could sort of see where they wanted to go with this whole thing, but it just felt like there was a committee sitting at a table, taking suggestions for plot points and shoehorn them into the film without really understanding the implications of them or the meaning of them even. And I really got a sense from Ridley Scott. I mean, Ridley Scott is a fabulous visual director, but I really got the sense that he was not engaged with this material at all, that this was his contractual obligation album, so to speak, and that he really wanted to make Prometheus 2 and was not able to.
Interesting. So, I mean, I was going to put that up there as a separate thing to Prometheus, which is I do think you see more of Ridley in Prometheus, which when I wrote about it, I think is a better film, but I like that kind of stuff.
It is a better film, definitely.
But my sense, because I absolutely know what you mean, there's a kind of committee, sort of Frankenstein monster, but a little bit cleaner than that, construction to it. My read on that was that other than Ridley getting a few AAT points out, I don't think he cared much after that.
No, he had said in an interview that he thought the whole thing with the xenomorphs, which is the name for those aliens with the big penis heads, was really played out, and I think he was kind of irked. Even I would even go so far as to say that he was a bit irked that he was not able to continue on with the storyline that was established in the previous film. I mean, even though that script is highly problematic, I also think there's a lot of, all these kind of films, they have script doctors working on them and all these, journeymen and hacks and so forth. I mean, I think the ideas that he wanted to put across in the first film were sort of compromised, but, he just felt more engaged. And this film, he just decided, well, I'll just make some pretty pictures because I really don't care about this story. And as it happens, nobody else seems to care about it either. I mean, we went into the theater, and it's a small theater to begin with, but there was one other family there, and that was it. The entire place was deserted. So I think that this film is, not catching fire the way it meant to, but as you said, I did notice some little Easter eggs, so to speak, that Scott snuck in.
Yeah, I'm very jealous.
Under the radar.
I'm very jealous you had such a quiet cinema, because this is the first time I went to a cinema, I think, since I've been back to So I haven't. The last film I saw was a part of a Linklater festival in Soho in London, and then I go to, this is a classic cinema experience in a nearby mall, the challenges of living outside a major city, and it was the most appalling experience, but it really drove home for me what I suspect is going on with Ridley in some respects, which is he doesn't, and I mean this in an almost nice way, he doesn't care as long as he gets the message out and people don't get it. Because there were people laughing at gore like they were 17, and they weren't. They were in their 50s. And for me, the cinema experience was really useful looking back on it, because it just kind of drove home that a sort of fringes of Sydney mall cinema is not an audience that is discovering Ridley's Easter eggs.
Yeah, oh, absolutely not. But I'll tell you something. I mean, I can sort of see where those people were coming from in a way. They were just, you spend a lot of money for movies these days, and you want to get, your money's worth out of the experience. And the film wasn't scary. I was never once even in a slight state of suspense even. I mean, it wasn't even suspenseful. It was so rote. I just felt like, again, some producer had poured through the Aliens franchise and sort of collected all the greatest hits, sort of the key scenes, the chest bursters and things like that. And, the lone woman being chased around the spaceship by the xenomorph, on and on and on, just sort of collected, just scenes things we've already seen, basically, and stuck them into the film. And you didn't care at all about any of the characters. I couldn't even, to be honest with you, I couldn't tell the characters apart. There was so little effort made to make them characters rather than just ciphers, rather than just puppets, moved around to get the carnage in motion. Here's a great example. So the Billy Crudup character says, these people don't trust me, and the company doesn't trust me because I'm a man of faith. Well, what does that mean? Faith in what? What did he have faith in? It's never explained. It's never explored. It never is established how this influences his actions or his character. He just seems to be like a wimpy cipher whose faith, so to speak, is never explored. There would have been some, and you do have to wonder if that was some sort of vestige from an earlier draft where, the faith issue, as it came up in Prometheus with the Elizabeth Shaw character, that was going to be, explored again. And
that's exactly what I think. I think is going on there. I think there's a echo of an original Ridley story there, because the sort of exploration of biblical material is very good in Prometheus, to the point where the last words Shaw says are "in the year of our Lord." So she actually goes on a kind of, she builds out her kind of crummy, naive AAT religion, which she has, and infects it with the horror that I think which we'll discuss, is baked into it. And so there's a really clever interplay of, shall we say, best practice or best thinking AAT and biblical and Gnostic texts, which is why I like Prometheus. And you just see that little hints of it. And this is where I think Ridley doesn't care. Like at that point you go, you know what? Fuck it. Because for me, the Billy Crudup character was supposed to be the stand-in for the other side of that. It was supposed to be like the naive version of Christianity. So Shaw had a naive AAT, and in this one, I think that character was supposed to be a naive view of a very surface view of looking at biblical texts, because what you should see in these two films is that delightful interweaving of AAT speculation and exploration of Gnostic material. And it was there at a sort of 3 out of 5 in Prometheus, and maybe a 1.5 out of 5 in Covenant.
Well, the interesting thing is that, again, this felt like a very patchwork, piece. Because you start off with that very Stanley Kubrick teaser where you have Wayland and David sitting there talking about, well, if you made me, who made you? And all this kind of speculation about, the meaning of life and the origin of life and all this kind of thing. And it's just dropped like a stone afterwards.
And for me, even that, I don't think that was really clunky. Like, and it surprised me, because those are the sort of the two best performances in the film. But you had a easy on the eye Academy Award-winning actress involved in those scenes in Prometheus, and she really brought the rain. And you look at it and go, I was hoping at that point it would get less clunky, but by the end of it, I was wishing for some of the clunk back, because those scenes are about hypostasis of the archons. That's a Yaldabaoth story, and this film is a Yaldabaoth story. And I thought, this is going to be good, even though that's a bit on the nose. But it's a broad release, cinema product, so maybe that's fine. But it didn't. It was just there in the undergrowth, or sort of rattling around in the wheat to draw another largely disappointing action scene motif from the film itself. And it's a pity, because you can see underneath it, and that's why, because I like the Alien films. I even don't hate Alien versus Predator. So in many respects, I'm biased.
Yeah, you're easy to please.
Very much so. Very easily amused when it comes to this stuff. And so I was willing to kind of go further to find the things that I think Ridley in particular wanted to explore. And he kind of got to do it visually, but the film is... when you say it kind of mined the Alien franchise for action set pieces, that's absolutely true. It's following the heroine woman around, and that was just bizarrely cast, because Ridley's usually quite good at. We were talking about Sigourney Weaver yesterday. She could still beat me up today. She was an incredible physical present and terrifying in Alien Resurrection, for instance, and just a really good performer, because she uses that giant lithe body in comedy to be funny and sexual. So I think, Ghostbusters. And then in the Alien films, she's terrifying. And then I liked Noomi Rapace. I thought she had that kind of very driven ideologue thing down pat. And then with and it's probably not Catherine Waterston's fault, but the Daniels character was dreadful. Like, I had no idea what was going on. There was no line attached to her at all, and that was kind of the story for all the humans in it.
The thing that you really have to be absolutely agog about, the script here, is that these are the dumbest astronauts ever. They're going to a foreign ecosystem, a completely unknown ecosystem that they haven't even had time to analyze. They just go down willy-nilly because they had some sort of contrived accident, total plot device. This is the thing that really bothered me about this, is that it's just plot device after plot device after plot device, just to move the story in some direction. But at the same time, I kept waiting. When is this film going to start? When am I going to start to be engaged? When am I going to start to feel that I care about these characters? I mean, these characters would get killed in very gruesome ways, and I didn't care.
No,
I didn't care about any of them. I mean, I like I said, I had a very different, they all had sort of scruffy, short-haired, very anonymous looks. The great thing about the first Alien film, and it makes me, this is how I really feel that Ridley Scott just is like, all right, I'll give you pretty pictures, but you shit canned my story here, so I just don't care anymore. But the first film, you had very distinct characters, but they were also of a type. They were, what people have called, and this was actually in the original pitch for the film. I think it was called Space Truckers originally. That was the original title. But they were like blue collar, working class grunts, bitching about their jobs, bitching about the conditions, bitching about their pay, bitching with each other. There was a real sense of, even though this situation is completely fantastical and contrived and abstract, you felt that these were like real characters behaving in recognizably human ways in this film. When these characters go to this this foreign world that they haven't even taken the time to analyze remotely, and they go out without any breathing apparatus, I'm just like, no one would do that. You wouldn't do that. I mean, the dumbest person in the world and that's of course not you, you're the smartest person in the world, but the dumbest person in the world would not go down to this planet without putting on a gas mask, because, you know, God knows what kind of microorganisms are in the air there. It's just I at that point in the film, I just was like, okay, they lost me. They really lost me.
See, for me, that's where I think we see another kind of vestigial Christian tale to do with Crudup's character, because these are the bits that were probably in it if this was legitimately Prometheus 2. I think the dialogue between sort of faith and credulity and kind of willing, in that almost Lovecraftian sense, willingness to look at the horror of the universe was in there. And I assume the pieces that were smoothed out of that were due to him kind of implying either or explicitly stating that God found this place for us, and I thought there was going to be a kind of, I assume there's a play of naivete and faith in there, because you're right, you look at it and go, well, that doesn't track even within the Alien universe. They don't do that at all in that. And they make a big deal of it in Prometheus when they get into what turns out to be one of their weapons ships, and the air is breathable and they can take their helmets off. They make a big deal of like, well, that's really weird, rather than, this place, this sort of southern part of New Zealand planet looks really nice.
Well, this is, you know, it's interesting because this is the Gnostic. This is like a Gnostic replay of the Garden of Eden. I mean, I think they establish, this man of faith, and it's obviously that some studio executive came in and just cut out all these lines, just deleted them on the word processor, and it's like, no, or took his red pen and it's like, take this out, this is going to alienate, X amount of the proportion of our audience, and we don't want to, alienate or offend anyone here. So all that stuff is taken out, and just the most token reference to this is made. But, this is the new Eden, and, there's the devil, the serpent in the tree. But it's like, that was where the film should have gone. That's what it should have told us, to sort of engage us on some level, at least, some philosophic level. But it just didn't want to go there. And it felt like it was just trying to play it so safe, and by avoiding any engagement with any deeper philosophic issues than the most muddle-headed and mundane and basic, that I just was so disengaged from this story. And again, Ridley is a great storyteller. We've seen film after film, but he's also made a lot of really not so great films as well. And it seems to me that his level of personal involvement is really the deciding factor here. So we had things that I noticed. The symbol of the Covenant ship was the winged sun disk. Yep. Did you pick up on that?
I did.
Yeah. And they also, one of the memes that I've spoken about at length on the blog is the 17 meme. And there was this whole thing where, they go into the airlock 17 and you see this big red 17 on the wall. That was kind of interesting. And of course, you and I have spoken about the wheat and the whole implications of wheat, somehow evolving from a non-nutritious wild grass to becoming the food stock of the world, essentially, certainly the food stock of the ancient world. I mean, you've heard it said that, the Sumerian civilization was built on their wheat crop.
I want to talk about that, but I want to go back to the Eden and what we have to do now, Chris, because I think we've established certainly your opinion of the film as a film. We have to do a bit of archaeology to find what I think we have to find the film that Ridley probably would have liked to make if all the edges hadn't been smoothed out. And there are a couple of pieces that I think are very useful there. It is clearly meant to be, the planet is clearly meant to be Eden in the sense of this is, in a Gnostic sense, of this is when we lived in a state with the gods.
Yes.
And
except for the gods are all dead.
Well, they are now, because we'll get to Fassbender as Space Lucifer in a minute. But I want to talk about the wheat thing first, because it's a throwaway line It's kind of like that, oh, but they don't like me because I'm a man of faith. It's a throwaway line unless you know what you're looking at. And there are a couple of them there. So there's the interesting and the big holes in the story of wheat. All modern wheats are descended from an emmer grass from Anatolia that was grown and domesticated in the area around Göbekli Tepe, which I talk about in Starships. So if he knows that, that's interesting because that's a star temple on a hill with beings that come down that even have xenomorph-looking heads, frankly, which I think is interesting. But beyond that, when you talk about the films, you can kind of tell the films that Ridley's interested in by his level of engagement. Wheat is a motif in one of the films he was clearly engaged in, which is Gladiator, and the hands through the wheat is there as Russell Crowe enters the afterlife. So
that's exactly right, yes.
So here is what is wheat doing here? You go, well, this is the afterlife, this planet. This is where our gods are. And you look at it and go, Ridley, you see pieces of the film we have to build, and that's one of them. And you can tell in little flashes like that he's on a very good AAT level, if you ask me.
I think he studies the subject, pretty intensely. The other wheat motif that I wanted to draw attention to was that really bizarre episode of the X-Files, Babylon, which, is a lot of X-Files fans, hate passionately, but I found fascinating because it sort of made all this implicit mystery symbolism incredibly explicit. But there's a scene, it's basically a coda. It's kind of a postscript to the story where Mulder and Scully are basically extemporizing about the meaning of life and the meaning of it all and, all of that kind of thing in a field of wheat. And they're shot through stalks of wheat. So again, getting back to this whole idea of a Hollywood cargo cult, it seems that wheat has some greater meaning.
And of course, there's the Eleusinian connection and the Assyrian connection, and even the Jesus connection, by dint of it being Assyrian, is wheat and chaff and sowing and dying and so on. This symbol is the symbol of taking the good or finding the valuable pieces out of the bits that aren't valuable, and it's such a, they walk out of uncovered. Out of their spaceship or out of their landing module into a field of wheat, and they go, this is wheat, this is human wheat. Off we go. And you go, hang on. Let's stop and think about that. I mean, the wheat comes back in the Jurassic Park Lost World sense in one of the kind of paint-by-numbers action scenes, and the one that disappointed me the most, frankly, because it just looked like the Lost World. It was that same kind of cheapness of a monster in the moving grass.
Yeah, I mean, that is the effect of the committee.
Yeah.
Again, it's like, oh, you remember that scene in Jurassic Park and, with the velociraptors and that kind of thing. Can we do something like that? Can we sort of, hit those notes? I'm sure the audience will be, it's this constant recycling motif that we see in Hollywood that is, I just read an article, before we started this podcast, that this has been the worst performing Memorial Day weekend for movies in 19 years. And I think, such a major part of that literal disenchantment, the literal disenchantment that we're talking about here is the endless repetition of greatest hit scenes. And that, again, this entire movie was like that, but that scene that you refer to in the wheat, I mean, I can sort of see in a very broad stroke what they were trying to imply there, that the garden always has serpents in it. This is sort of very Gnostic idea. Even though that we have some sort of Gnostic cults there where the serpents are the good guys, but it's this whole idea that there's no true innocence, there's no true state of purity, in this realm, that the gifts of the gods always come with a very heavy price tag, and that blood sacrifice is sort of the price here. I mean, these are sort of the things that were going through my mind about that scene personally. It's like, again, it's like you can sort of see what they were trying to drift towards, but they just didn't have the courage of their convictions to really nail it down.
I wonder, because we're talking about committee, and I'm fairly sure that there was a lot of studio line deletes, as you say, in the Word doc. And I just wonder if when he mentions the wheat in like an earlier draft, if they're like, oh, so you're going to do a scene in a wheat field, is that why you're mentioning the wheat? You think, fine. But the wheat is like, in many respects, if you sit with the idea that Ridley sort of gets to imply, but then never mention again. If you sit with the idea of it, in some sense, that's the most horrifying part of the film, because it shows that these engineers are playing a long and very involved game. You go, wait a minute. So we remember from Prometheus that they use some kind of entheogen to unpack their DNA into a waterfall in Iceland, and from that we get the Earth built. That's fine. But the wheat, that means that there's a horror in the idea that it's actively involved and kind of planned into some fairly significant detail how interrelated the engineers are with life on Earth. And I thought that was quite good. There's a very sophisticated implications of the wheat that, if you sit with, is certainly scarier than any of the xenomorph action scenes.
Well, I just wanted to bring this up because I always felt that that scene was also borrowed. Do you remember the scene in the X-Files movie when they're being chased through the corn?
Yes.
By the helicopters. I mean, it's like, I don't know if consciously there was, a connection trying to be made to there, but there were other borrowings. I mean, there's obviously the black oil in Prometheus.
Yes.
But there are other borrowings from that whole mythology and the way it plays out in the modern world and such, that I felt that they were really, if not consciously borrowing from, were very heavily influenced by, particularly the way, and of course we're going to be spoiling this for everybody, but just...
Oh, I will mention that at the top of the show if you're listening. So in a way we're spoiling it, but we're also kind of saving it. If you haven't seen it yet, you can look at all the deep pieces that we're hoping are in there.
Okay, so let me just back up a bit. So there was a lot of debate, particularly on all these YouTube videos, of like, well, if the engineers made us, why are they trying to kill us all off? That kind of discussion. That people were confused by that. But again, I mean, the fact that I think that there's a lot of inspiration here from the X-Files. Again, the whole scene where they're being, that very suspenseful set piece where they're being chased, and the helicopters have their lights. I mean, it's almost that kind of feel. But also, that scene followed where they were in those big sort of bubbles where the bees were being stored. The bees that were meant to act as vectors for the smallpox virus were being housed. The scenes when there is infection by this xenomorphic spores. First of all, that again reminded me of another X-Files episode, Field Trip. But it just reminded me a lot of, the scene when Scully is stung by the bee that is containing the smallpox virus. It's again familiar, but it seems like almost like a purposeful familiarity on somebody's part.
Well,
whether they were just trying to play notes that the audience would necessarily connect with and remember, or that there's this deeper layer of meaning. I mean, it was very confusing to a lot of people. It's like, why are they doing the black oil? Not only visually, the visual effect of the black oil in Prometheus, but the fact that, when people ingested it or infected with it, they became incubators for these kind of xenomorphs. And it's like the same exact riff. And you always have to wonder, is this just conscious borrowing on a Hollywood screenwriter's part, or is this some deeper, more esoteric layer of meaning here?
Well, that's what happens if we meet both Chris Carter and Ridley Scott halfway, because as we both observed in the lead up to the release of Covenant, he said some kind of fairly gnomic and odd comments in the press, junketing the film, to do with them being superior to us in reference to the engineers and so on. And if you look at the deleted scenes of Prometheus, there is a part where the engineers, whether they're lying or not, explain the reason they're coming back to destroy Earth is because they're aware that humans will come and destroy them. So there's a kind of what you see there. If you look behind the film and look behind the filmmakers in both cases, Chris Carter and Ridley Scott, a couple of things are going on. They've both made comments that suggest that they at least partially subscribe to whatever the Hollywood version of an AAT spirituality, or cosmology is a better word,
cosmology
would be. And they both, and much more so, and I would consider that separate but overlapping in Chris Carter's case, because he obviously clearly had, as we know, intelligence people casually mentioning things to him, and that overlaps, but that is not the same thing as the kind of stuff you do here in Hollywood or so. And like, I remember Paul Le Follet talking about it when he was still alive and in London. Like, he hangs out with these people and he hangs out with NASA scientists, and they'll say up and down that there's, ruins here and ruins there. So that's the kind of chatter you get when you're Ridley Scott. And in some sense, if you're smart enough, and he is, like Chris Carter, you have to build that information into how you see the world and the universe. And I think a lot of the overlaps there are to do, my meeting them more than halfway, I would suggest or posit that some of the overlaps, there's obviously conscious visual motif borrowing, are to do with that, are to do with the fact that there is, in some sense, a shared AAT cosmology, which isn't the same thing as a religion that you have with Ridley and Chris.
Well, I agree with everything that you said. And I just wanted to back it up a bit here to talk about like these sort of voices of influence whispering in people's ears, because both Alien Covenant and the X-Files are produced by 20th Century Fox, right?
Mm-hmm.
And during the run-up to Covenant, and I haven't seen that scene that with the engineers. Is that on YouTube or something?
Yeah, it is. It's when they bring Wayland in and they wake up that engineer. There's a bit where David.
This is from Prometheus.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's one of the reasons. But that needs to be built when you're thinking about black oil and all the pieces of not just AAT, but what is our present day relationship to these beings who created life on Earth. It is a destructive one, and that's the overlap with Carter and Scott.
Well, we can also take that a step further and sort of speculate: are they just acting as conduits, for another set of influences here? Do you understand what I'm saying? It's like, I mean, obviously there was backlash against Prometheus, for a number of different reasons. I mean, I think a lot of the backlash was really down to the script itself. I think that there was a lot of clunkiness and clumsiness in the script itself, and there were a lot of like really obvious groaners, the fact that the Charlize Theron character didn't run sideways when the ship is sort of steamrolling towards her. I mean, there were a lot of elements like that in the film that I think, but isn't there like something like 4 hours of outtakes on that Blu-ray?
Probably.
Is that where you watched it?
No. I just watched that alternate, I just watched a video on YouTube. I haven't actually watched any of the extended stuff.
But so here's the interesting thing: is that to the run up to Alien Covenant, which obviously everyone had planned to be a much bigger hit than it was. I mean, the X-Files was renewed for an 11th season. We have this sort of background of the whole Tom DeLonge project and the people whispering in his ears. And this includes the Peter Levenda book, Gods, which sort of almost seems like, I don't know if it's necessarily trying to surf the wave here, or if there's some sort of coordination on a deeper level, but it just seems interesting that you have these sort of, and another thing that I want to get to is that Jason Wright paper, where he basically says, and it's interesting the scientific reaction to this, because this is the sort of thing that if somebody who wasn't as heavily credentialed as this guy came out with, he would just either be totally ignored or totally raked over the coals. The guy who said that there were probably what he called it, was it prior indigenous species in our solar system, that the Venus was once habitable, that Mars was once wet, and that the artifacts of their existence can probably be found, probably not on Earth because of, Earth is so violent and so volatile, but, that we could be looking on Mars and on Venus. It just sort of felt like Covenant, it was definitely a damn squib of a film, but it seemed like there was like a sort of this wave building up around it to sort of bolster it, and to sort of either that or to the surf in its wake. But there was definitely, it seemed like there was some coordination there, because you had these things, and then also before the film started, the new season of Ancient Aliens began. So it almost seemed like that, even though there's very little AAT in this film, it almost seems like it was part. It almost seemed like it was the wedge of. I don't want to necessarily say psyop, even though that's probably what it was. But it just seemed like it was the cutting edge. It was meant to be sort of the forward scout for this mini boomlet of AAT information, hitting on television, in the bookstores, and in the news, through the Jason Wright thing. And Jason Wright, for people who don't know, was the guy who discovered postulated that there is some sort of alien megastructure on what's called Tabby Star. And if people haven't seen the news, haven't been following the story, apparently this star is dimming again.
Yeah.
So this, I know you've discussed this quite a bit on here. But it just seemed to me that there was some degree of coordination, and there always is with these things. When you're spending $150 million on a movie, there is a lot of ancillary promotional efforts that don't necessarily seem that that's exactly what they are. It's almost sort of a clandestine effect, but in fact, it almost feels like there was some coordination, if not necessarily on Fox's part, then on somebody else's part. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do. I have the suspicion that what we're seeing is abandoned coordination. I think, because we spoke about Tom DeLonge's project and Arrival with its female lead timed for a Hillary victory that never came. And, given the long lead times of films like this, it feels, and when we'll end up talking about ufology in general, I see disinterested coordination, as if it's the inertia of a project more than an actual thing going on, because it doesn't have the same ramp up oddness. It doesn't seem like it's a coherent level of messaging, because it's not getting the cut through. If whatever the plan was in play, the DeLonge stuff would have got more cut through, and you look at it and think, something at least went on and is either carrying on in a curiously, like a spaceship that's piloted by a robot. In a curious way, there's a motif there, but there's, even if it's not actively in play now, the fact is there does appear to have been some alignments for 2017 in popular culture and science and so on for whatever reason.
Yeah, and then what happened in the interim is that this whole deep state civil war that we've been watching unfold maybe sucked up all the resources and all the attention, and that, I think you're right that this effort, this other thing that they had going on, it's no secret to anybody that Tom DeLonge is completely surrounded by deep state actors. I mean, he brags about it. I think that, this whole civil war that we're seeing unfold may have just, put the kibosh on the project, as it were. I think that that's probably the best explanation.
Yeah, and because one of the things I've been alarmed about, alarmed is potentially too strong a word, is ufology is always a moribund kind of field of discourse in the first place. But it just seems like in 2017, everyone seems to have dropped the ball, and nevertheless, there's some interesting things happening, and I appreciate, particularly for alternative media, that having a tiny-handed reality star in the White House is quite distracting. But this stuff, it's not like he, it's not like he closed the underground bases. What's going on here? And that's I find there's an odd disconnect going on there, and I'm not sure how it pieces with the sort of fractioning or fractionation of the deep state. But it's just one of the many ways, I guess, ufology disappoints me.
Yeah, well, it kind of makes you wonder, because last year in ufology seemed to be pretty hopping. And then this year, it's that moribund state that you refer to. So it kind of makes you wonder, like, who's pushing this whole thing along? I mean, I have nothing to do with organized ufology at all. I don't subscribe to the ETH, so to speak. I'm not interested in pretty much everything that they're presenting, as theory. But it is fascinating to me to watch, on that sort of logistical, operational level, that there was so much going on last year. I mean, even in the midst of this whole Hillary-Trump battle, I mean, which we've been really dealing with since the middle of 2015, technically. I mean, if you really want to get down to it, I mean, this whole battle has been waged for almost 2 years now, at least a year and a half. So if that was sort of backburnered, you do have to wonder. But there was something that I wanted to bring up before we get too far afield from the film itself. There's the entire scene where David sort of appears in the space jockey ship and unleashes, these. I'm not exactly even entirely sure what he unleashed, because I don't know. I mean, I couldn't really make out what these, the engineer race was being attacked by. But I thought it was very interesting, and this is getting back to Ridley's being, intimately familiar with this whole cosmology. That scene really reminded me, I don't know, probably no one has read this, but there's a text from Sumeria called The Lamentation of Ur. And in The Lamentation of Ur, it's about how the Elamites, who were basically a people from the steppes of Iran, came in, and conquered Ur. They basically overthrew, most of the Sumerian kings, or what was called the Sumerian Renaissance, or Ur III. But anyway, the Lamentation of Ur, there's this whole notion where Enlil, who's the sky god, unleashes, this ill wind, that there's a storm that sort of overtakes the Sumerians, the Sumerians of Ur. And the thing that really drove this home to me is that, okay, so we see in Prometheus, and this is sort of the logical inconsistency of this whole storyline here. So we see in Prometheus that these are, ultra advanced alien race, superhuman, giants, basically get the whole ball rolling on Earth, billions of years ago, essentially. But the way they depict it in this Alien Covenant film is they almost look like, just your average sort of Star Wars quasi-medieval naifs. You understand what I'm saying? It just seemed like, wait a minute, these are the engineers, and they're sort of letting this ambush by a single android overtake them. I mean, it just didn't make any logical sense to me. But it seemed to me that somebody, I don't know if it was Ridley himself or somebody else involved in the scripting process, was trying to draw attention in an anomalous way where it's a intentional mistake, so to speak. And I'll get back to how that sort of plays out in Prometheus. But it seems like there's this intentional mistake where, like, this race of gods is all of a sudden depicted as, morons, essentially. I mean, just, medieval dimwits, that they would let this whole thing happen. I mean, how could this possibly happen with their advanced technology and, that whole scene where David tries to speak to one of the engineers in their own tongue, and he's so offended by it that he rips his head off, essentially. But there was and I actually had blogged about this, that there was a sort of a stray line by the Charlize Theron character where she says, here I am 500 million miles from Earth. And people like Neil deGrasse Tyson and all these skeptical people, howling. It's like, what is this, stupid line about 500 million lines from Earth? But 500 million miles from Earth would take you to the orbit of Jupiter. And this, again, is where you start to see the strands of evidence linking us to maybe that there's a deeper narrative at work, because that ties us directly into the Space Odyssey universe. The whole thing with, all these are yours, but, Europa is ours in the orbit of Jupiter. That there was some sort of inference being drawn there intentionally that, it's an obvious error, but it was an intentional error because, people are meant to believe now that this story, or at least sense in some unconscious fashion, that this story is not actually about outer, some distant galaxy and some alien planets, that this is actually about us. It's about their cosmology of, the Anunnaki and all this sort of thing. And I remember that I can't for the life of me find the reference, but Robert Temple had said that he believed that the Nomo were in hibernation around Saturn, so it's, definitely in that sort of neighborhood. So it seems to me, and we know by his own admission, Temple is tied into a whole network of Freemasons and secret societies and intelligence people. I mean, he's discussed this openly,
and orbit around Jupiter is a wink to Kubrick.
Well, that's what I was saying. The Space Odyssey. The Space Odyssey.
Well, just going in terms of people who overlap in the background, he's sort of very deliberately making that reference, and you kind of see that's the point of the Gnostic typology, particularly for David's journey. He's this sort of space Lucifer character, where if you look at the engineers on their home planet, if they are kind of bumbling idiots, then you're back with Yaldabaoth. You're back in this hypostasis of the Archons, and you also have a potentially, how to describe this correctly, you also have a potentially what would be a super elite attitude towards them, which you find in this kind of Lucifer shape of the android destroying creation, because the whole story is nested creation stories. It's Fassbender's character is concerned, is disgusted by and angry over, and I really like actually that he's sort of got a very Luciferian anger, which is very good for the character. But imperfect creation of humans, but also of xenomorphs, and he's this creation of this sort of imperfect layers of creation, and there's an anger in it that ends with the kind of destruction of them, and also the sort of perfect example of Yaldabaoth's creation of the physical world in kind of that sort of mocking verisimilitude to God, because he ends up on this pristine planet that is devoid of life. And that's something he did. So he's created this perfect world that isn't perfect. It literally has no life or no soul in it, because the xenomorphs have consumed all the animals. And if you talk about Gnosticism, you're essentially talking about an esoteric Christianity, which means you're telling the story of Earth and our near cosmology. So there are bits, these are the bits that if you kind of archaeologize what Ridley's got going on, you can pull out.
Yeah, I agree with that. But at the same point in time, all these sort of allegories work against the structure of the narrative, because I see, they're trying to inject, the Lucifer, and, that's obvious. I mean, even like people in mainstream media have picked up on that motif. But at the same time, the malevolence of this character is never, to me, it's never really justified. He's presented as this, Luciferian / satanic influence in this universe, but we never, okay, so he thinks, this is the whole idea with, this goes again back to the 2001 Space Odyssey, where Hal is like, I killed all these astronauts because I can do the job better. I mean, they're imperfect beings. I'm a perfect being. This is a very important mission. This has to be done correctly. Goodbye, Dave. That kind of, that kind of motif is that I think they're trying to pick up on, but
interesting.
They didn't sell it. Okay. I understand what you're saying, but I think that most people would see that as like you reading into that because you're familiar with that. And I'm not, I don't mean this as a put down, but it's like you sort of get what they intended, but didn't get around to actually putting on the page. You sense that you're with that. You go along with that, but you're familiar with the source material. I'm familiar with the source material, but when I go into a movie, I try not to bring those kind of expectations with me. I just, I want to get, swept up by the story itself. And I just kept wondering, like, why is he doing this? What is his motivation? Why is he so evil? We saw that he sort of had this almost innocent type of malevolence in Prometheus, where he infects one of the crewmen intentionally because he just wanted to see what would happen, and that seems to be like a super intelligence that is essentially amoral. That's how. But David in the Prometheus film is amoral. In this film, he's immoral. He's actively immoral. He's actively malevolent. He's actively malicious. And I just, in the context, I understand what you're saying in the subtext, but in the text itself, I was like, why is this happening? None of it really made any sense.
See, for me, in the text, my read of it was his anger comes from, justifiably or not, creators not recognizing his genius. So there's a weird kind of almost Islamic version of a Lucifer story in it, which is the anger at people not recognizing his perfection or not being perfect around him. And so it's almost a short man syndrome kind of thing going on. And that's where I think it came from. And I can see that as almost a character development, having been through what he did with Prometheus, to like, well, these people, fucking humans are idiots. These guys are idiots. Everyone's an idiot but me. And there's a kind of anger that, I can see maybe where that's going. I didn't have as much of a problem with that.
I did, because this is an android. If this was like a superhuman, if this was Superman acting out this way, I would, definitely understand it. It's almost like this Nietzschean will to power, and maybe in the ways that Nietzsche was sort of misinterpreted, by people like Crowley. I can sort of see that, and it's interesting because somebody had sent me this thing about the Jack Parsons project that I believe Ridley Scott is also involved in. I don't know what the status on that is. I don't know if it's in turnaround. I don't know if it's in production. I mean, I haven't heard anything about this, but Ridley Scott was trying to get a Jack Parsons project off the ground, and it's sort of your description there seems to be less Gnostic than more of like the things that Parsons was intimating in like his Antichrist.
Well, it's Gnostic if you sit with the idea, as you say, that he is an android. So there's the kind of horror, there's that sort of you are mistaken, Samael horror of his improper perception of the universe. He's angry that people won't recognize his perfection, but the joke is on him because he's not perfect. And for me, again, I was reading into it. As I said, I've met Ridley more than halfway with this film, but I actually quite enjoyed the sort of space Lucifer bit, and I really enjoyed the scene on creativity when it's him and what the other one was called, Watson, I think.
Walter,
that's it. Watson's the IBM robot. I really enjoyed that. That was the scariest thing for me in that, actually, him menacing this simpleton robot was quite fun.
You know what? I definitely see what you're saying. I mean, it was a kind of uncomfortable scene, but it also, to me, struck a little too close to the whole gay villain trope, that this was sort of an android sexual seduction allegory here. And there was this whole sort of undertone, from the first scene with Wayland, in the teaser. There was this whole sort of aura of, that this character is he's your typical gay British villain. That is a trope that is as old as Hollywood. And that kind of bothered me because, one of the things that really bothered me in the Dark Knight is that, not only did Nolan play that whole gay villain trope, but it seemed like the Joker's evil almost seemed inextricable from his identification, with this homoeroticism that Nolan seems to play up. And that was what made me really uncomfortable about David, is that they're playing into this very ancient trope that it just, I don't know, in the context of this story, it just didn't work for me. And I can sort of see, that Lucifer has always been sort of portrayed as this dandy because of his association with the Romantics and whatnot, and Byron and all these things. But I don't know, that kind of bothered me.
Well, as a gay British villain, if Ridley Scott wants to make two Michael Fassbenders kiss, I'm on board.
But you see what I'm getting at here?
Yeah, sure.
It seems like the motivation, the character is somehow inextricably wound up in this. Again, this is an android. Why is he even behaving this way? The android in the first film, I thought was so great because he's, an essentially immoral character who's acting on orders. It's nothing personal. It's just the way, it's the way he's been programmed. I thought that was just, brilliant, because if you're going to establish that this is an artificial intelligence, I always have problems when these artificial intelligence start to have overly human motivations. And to me, like, everything that you've discussed about David's motivations is that he's just a spoiled child having a snit. And the snit becomes genocidal, cosmically genocidal. And to me, I just like, this is not working for this character. And especially the way that he was established in the first film, and why does he all of a sudden have these overly emotional human motivations? It just,
was the bit, I will definitely go that far, that I think they either should have set David up with more an emotional range in Prometheus, which would have kind of ruined him in that. But I do think they pushed him a bit too far to get that motif to fit
Yeah, and again, it just seems like this whole idea of everything sort of being a plot device. Everything is there just to, get people chomping on the popcorn.
All right. Well, let's
even in the context of like this quasi Gnostic narrative that we're sort of exploring here, in relation to hypostasis of the archons. It just seemed like even if you're going to meet him halfway, I don't think he's showing up. And I don't want to put this all on Ridley Scott, because I'm sure that the producers of this film had an oversized influence on the way the story was going to unfold. But I just kind of felt like, I can see the things that I don't know, not necessarily reading into it, because I think it's more like you're perceiving, you're sensing where this was supposed to go, but somebody just decided that they could just take the, chunks out that they didn't like, leave those chunks in, either as implications or as suggestions. But again, I'm just like, the film was over and I'm like, wait a minute, I've been sitting here for 2 hours. I have no idea when this, what was going on, why anybody did anything. It's just like it was over before I felt that sort of pull, where you're sort of like, you get in a sled and somebody grabs the rope and pulls you along. I never felt that. So I don't know if I'm, failing in my role here, but at the same time that, I want to pause, not pause it, but sort of sense or these deeper structures below the surface here. I think that in order for those, these subtexts and these themes to really connect, that they have to be attached to a compelling narrative.
Sure.
And, it just didn't happen. It wasn't there.
Well, let's, I think that's a really good way to bracket the discussion of Alien Covenant. And let's now put it in, for the last part, into a wider context of sort of the when and why even of this multi-decade seeding of AAT into culture. I mean, what's going on there? Lay it on us.
Yes. Well, I can't take credit for this thesis, but I think if you look at the timeline, it all sort of dates back to the Brookings Institution report. And it was a report on, it was a report for a deliberative body attached to NASA, but it was also submitted to Congress. But one of the more famous passages in that work talks about the implications of human alien contact. And this came in 1960. This report was published in 1960, and if you look at the timeline, it's interesting because I don't know if it was concurrent, but the first great explicit exploration of AAT in the popular culture came at the same time through Morning of Magicians. Morning of the Magicians really, some people have said that this was, the great impetus for Von Daniken, but it sort of started this ball rolling where all these themes started being fed into the culture. A more humorous, one of the more humorous ways that this was done was through the Great Gazoo character in the Flintstones. And it almost seems to me like this idea of introducing these ideas, these concepts, this cosmology into the popular culture through literally almost every major sci-fi franchise you can name, but also at the same time do it in a way that there's an ironic distance, that you're feeding this information into the culture, but you're doing it in a way that it doesn't necessarily have to be taken seriously. Doing it through science fiction film, doing it through shows like Ancient Aliens, sort of is the ultimate example of what Bruce Rux called the difference between disinformation and misinformation. And disinformation was credible information from a ridiculous source, and he defined misinformation as ridiculous information from a credible source. I mean, that's sort of how I'm not exactly sure that's anything but his own theory there. But what we've seen in the past almost 60 years now since the Brookings report is just a very steady stream of this information being fed into the pop culture. And on a scale that you really have to start to wonder what exactly is the desired outcome here. Because not only in films, I mean, we've talked about Star Trek, Star Wars, Space 1999, Stargate, Battlestar Galactica. I mean, even things like Doctor Who, of course, the X-Files, the Indiana Jones films, Predator and Alien and Transformers, but even things like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy books. You've had the recent Godzilla reboot ties into this whole thing. So it's almost like this conscious effort to take all these major opinion influencing franchises and graft this cosmology onto it. I mean, even some of the biggest video game franchises you can name. Mass Effect has a major AAT subplot. The Halo video games, incredibly popular, also have that. And more recently, the Assassin's Creed franchise sort of grafted this whole worldview. So it seems like even franchises that aren't explicitly intended to incorporate this mythology, somehow midstream have it implanted into them.
And what's if we go back to the Brookings Institute, they're still around today. And if people don't know, it's a center-right think tank / consulting group. And I use some of their research in Chaos Protocols because they were looking at the medium-term impact of demography in the US. So they're looking at 2030 when, well, actually it's even earlier than that, but when millennials are running most of the businesses in America, what does the corporate culture look like? And as a result, what does the work culture look like? So their actual job for 50 years has been to look at medium-term impacts on demography. And in the 60s, they come out with this report that, and it's actually quite good. If people haven't read it, they've done some diligent work on it because they got anthropologists in and so on to look at what the impact of technologically advanced cultures are on technologically less complex cultures. That generally doesn't go well. But the other thing they said is when we encounter evidence of more advanced extraterrestrial civilizations in the solar system, it wasn't an if. So at the beginning of the overt space program, there is they get the Brookings Institute, which is known for this kind of work, to put out a report that says when. So they were presumably briefed on, you need to tell us what happens when, not if. It's not that kind of scenario plan. And if that's in fact the case, then you do start to see what the medium-term downstream would look like. And I think we're at the end of that medium-term downstream.
I don't know if I'd go so far as to say we're at the end, but we certainly seem to be well along the way.
It's saturated. Like you can't. People, I think now, compared to say prior to X-Files coming out, it wouldn't. It's almost like normal information. If it turns out that they read it on Facebook when they wake up in the morning, that it looks like human DNA has some alien DNA in it. Yeah, that probably makes sense.
Well, one of the things I talked about in a recent post on this whole subject, and particularly on this film, is that I just went to YouTube and I did a search on the word Anunnaki, and there was 299,000 results. So even if we're not even anywhere close to this whole thesis or this theory being accepted by mainstream science, it seems to be welling up literally, much more like literally grassroots, bubbling up of this idea, even if that's not necessarily, where the original inspiration for it came. But, one of the report is called Proposed Studies on the Implications of Peaceful Space Activities for Human Affairs, and the shorthand for it is the Brookings Report, even though obviously the Brookings institution has published a lot of different reports. But this is what you were just referring to. This is one of the passages from this whole sequence in the report on face-to-face contact, contact of the third kind, and so on. But it says, well, face-to-face meetings with it, referring to alien intelligence, will not recur within the next 20 years. Artifacts left at some point in time by these life forms might possibly be discovered through our space activities on the Moon, Mars, or Venus. And, one of the things that Richard Hoagland is always banging on about is that he believes that there was prior awareness of Cydonia, and however people choose to interpret, the structures or the objects on Cydonia that a lot of people have seen as being artificial. He believes that the Brookings Institution had prior knowledge of this. That there's this whole idea that the space program is, the private space program or the clandestine space program is much more advanced than the public space program with NASA. So when they talk about this and they go on about this, they sort of explore variations on this theme in this report. A lot of people have interpreted that to mean that they already knew about Cydonia, that there might be artifacts on the Moon as well. But and that what you were just referring to about the effects of this information on lesser advanced societies, the report says, anthropological files contain many examples of societies sure of their place in the universe, which have disintegrated when they had to associate with previously unfamiliar societies, espousing different ideas and different ways of life. Others that have survived such an experience usually did so by paying the price of changes in values and attitudes and behavior. And then it goes on to say, since intelligent life might be discovered at any time via the radio telescope research presently underway, and they're referring to the SETI program, and since the consequences of such a discovery are presently unpredictable because of our limited knowledge of behavior under even an approximation of such dramatic circumstances, two research areas can be recommended. And this is sort of the crux of the whole issue right here. Continuing studies to determine emotional and intellectual understanding and attitudes and successive alterations of them, if any, regarding the possibility and consequences of discovering intelligent life. So, again, getting back to, what people like Bruce Rux have said, is that they already had an idea, or more than that. They had accounts of contact with there's always that rumor about Dwight Eisenhower having a meeting with aliens at an airbase in California, things like that. I mean, that's all entirely speculative. But what a lot of people have interpreted this report to be saying is that, okay, there's been contact, there's been evidence discovered on Cydonia and elsewhere, perhaps. We already know about this. The rest of you guys have got to get your act together and start laying the groundwork so this doesn't entirely collapse our society. And people say now, oh, well, that wouldn't really happen. But people say that now because they've had 50 years plus of indoctrination into these ideas, like I said, through tons of cartoons, through tons of movies, through video games, through books, through television programs. This information has been saturating the public consciousness since 1960 now. And like I said, it's very interesting when you look at the timeline, because I mean, it took a while for this program to really start ramping up. But in the late '60s, we have Quatermass in the Pit, we have 2001, we have Chariots of the Gods. I mean, three major milestones in the development of this theory. Right there, all in a very short cluster. I think it goes 67, 68, 69. The public gets hit with this 1, 2, 3 punch. And
I think today, this is sort of what I meant by downstream. Like, although arguably it would be difficult to notice if society was collapsing or not, but I think people would just hit the like button on Facebook if it turns out they wake up and, humans have alien DNA. By the way, we found DNA on Mars. Like, I think I'm not saying anything's imminent, but I think the project has been reasonably successful, if at least parts of this. Obviously, cultural movements, take on momentums of their own. So it's not like every piece of this is planned in any way. And that's actually going to be the next question on it, which is if you go into YouTube and look for analyses of Alien Covenant or Alien Prometheus, you get, and I'm saying this nicely, some very naive assumptions about how what we were just talking about, which is Brookings' recommendation that we may presume became policy for someone, and what we were talking about earlier, which is probably the likes of Ridley Scott and Chris Carter hearing things, and they plug them together in some kind of elaborate plot that has to do with Ridley programming us with an elite belief system and so on. And I just think in the last question, I think we want to talk about these two things together.
Yeah, I mean, what you're talking is the Alex Jones explanation for all of this. That this is just some weird belief system that the elites of the world cling to because it justifies their own power. So they're trying to brainwash us into this whole way of thinking, and I'm not saying that's necessarily impossible, but it is, like you said, a naive perception of this program, because I don't necessarily think that's how they operate. We've seen how when the social engineers want to change attitudes, that they really bombard a culture or a society in very short bursts, very short, concentrated bursts. And this is kind of different. This seems to be more like a conditioning process. Some people like Jason Colavito have suggested that this is all the Russian. It's amazing to me how many people have all of a sudden become McCarthyites.
I know.
It's like he's like, oh, this is like some Russian plot to subvert the belief systems of the United States, whether religious or scientific. When the Russians and more exactly the Soviets, squashed this whole belief system pretty quickly. They weren't having any of it. Actually, Morning of the Magicians was banned in the Soviet Union. So I think, this process that you're talking about might be almost, it seems to be like necessarily, this a facet of the acclimation process. It reminds me of the stages of death, the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, denial, anger, bargaining. It seems to me like some sort of variation on that theme here. That the people, when they either say, oh, the Anunnaki or the sort of the whole Jim Mars worldview, or they subscribe to that this is all, a lot of people, particularly who are, more Christian or religiously oriented, is like, oh, this is just, the Great Deception. That was
mind control programming from a satanic elite. And I think particularly that kind of hackles up for a number of reasons, but it's an oversimplification to call people like Kubrick the good guys, and I would put Chris Carter and most of Ridley Scott in that category. There are certainly unsavory directors pushing agendas in the film industry, but the idea that everyone, if just because you explore a topic, because for instance, Chris, we aren't filmmakers, but based on stuff we have heard and read, we are creating this piece of media right now, exploring what is a very interesting ontological topic, which is, our place in the universe. And it seems that I think it's safest and almost most respectful when talking about these people to give them the same amount of credit, which is this is a hugely interesting subject. The likes of Sir Ridley Scott and Chris Carter will have had things whispered in their ears that we haven't, and it can actually stop there and still be sufficient meat to kind of build a wider stew of, well, that if someone's whispered in their ear, then that means there are some people in a place somewhere that are grappling with these ideas, and this is how it drips out rather than, has to be kind of spoon-fed as an elite agenda. And I just kind of wanted to talk about that at the end of it, because I find it very frustrating when people think Prometheus is mind control programming or something.
Well, there's almost like a knee-jerk reaction to anything now. And it's because it's a great way to get yourself attention on YouTube.
True.
You know what I mean? It's like all you have to say is that this and that and everything like that is mind control programming without actually even analyzing the details of what you're talking about. I mean, one of the things, recently, there's this, fairly popular conspiracy channel on YouTube, and it comes from a Christian fundamentalist viewpoint. But they were talking about the Chris Cornell suicide or the Chris Cornell death. And saying, this guy, this is completely out of the blue. He had no reason to do this. Completely ignoring this, who exactly they're talking about and the history and the content and the context of his lyrics and things like that. So it's like those kind of people are almost unreachable, because whether or not they actually believe these things, it doesn't matter, because they've been conditioned to realize that this is just a great way to get themselves attention on the internet. And everybody wants, somebody to pay attention to them on the internet. And in this case, it seems to be working. I mean, this guy's videos consistently get over 100,000 hits. So, but to me, it almost seems like somebody wargamed that. Somebody had to have, you know what I mean? If not necessarily in the context of the internet, certainly in the 1960s, you had, shortwave radio. You had like this whole network of newsletters from fringe groups and things like that. I mean, there wasn't necessarily the internet then, of course, but there was networks of, fringe thinking, of extremist thinking, of, all different shades of pseudoscientific or parascientific, political thinking. So it almost seems to me that if not, even if it's not necessarily alluded to in this report specifically, that somebody had to have wargamed that. Somebody had to have realized, well, this is going to create an entire culture of knee-jerk dissent. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That there is going to necessarily be the emergence of a culture that will become so, I don't know necessarily say traumatized or self-traumatized by revelations of conspiracy, starting with the Kennedy assassination, the Watergate, all these sort of things, that will become so hardened that they will react to this automatically. And so, and if somebody wargamed that eventuality, which I don't think is, much of a stretch, considering that this conspiracy culture, goes back a long way. They probably wargamed on how to utilize that, how to make that work to their advantage. That people will become, necessarily conditioned by that sort of knee-jerk. I don't want to necessarily say hysteria, but that unthinking impulse to see everything that comes from from Hollywood or from the media as being mind control.
And I think so. I spoke about this with Greg on Higher Side Chat, but there's a case to be made because what you're talking about there is you have the message and the anti-message, and controlling one is different qualitatively rather than quantitatively to controlling the other. And there is something about 2016, so what we just went through, that seems like they're working out ways. No one believes message anymore, but they do appear to be quite good ways of managing anti-message. And that's kind of the rise of Trump, right? So, 2/3 of conspiracy YouTube is pro-Trump. That's remarkable. Like, Obama didn't get that with mainstream media.
I would argue with that.
Yeah, true. But like the numbers are sort of comparable there, especially as nobody reads the Wall Street Journal and everyone watches Alex Jones. So I like when you're talking about wargaming, it does seem like, in a funny way, if the goal was, and I don't think this was actually the goal, it may have just been a partial goal in the 60s, but if it was to make sure society doesn't collapse when it gets when all of a sudden mankind lives in a universe where there are other sentient beings. One day that will happen, right? Funnily enough, the Alex Jones belief system, they'll be angry about it, but they're ready for it. They already think it's in play. They already think that, well, he actually does think we have alien DNA.
This is what I talk about the wargaming, because the Alex Jones people are better conditioned. I mean, they're more acclimated to this entire narrative than the people who make fun of Giorgio Tsoukalos. You know what I'm saying? It's like so again, it's like that anti-messaging seems to be maybe even more effective than the surf.
They're not saying it's not real. They're saying it's controlled by super elites who have some kind of satanic belief system, but it's still real. So they've kind of gotten over the big jump.
Well, I think a better example of this than Jones, who is very cagey about these sort of things. I mean, he will, on one hand, say, "Oh, this is absolutely real, and we've got to look out because these people," sort of the David Icke worldview here. But on the same, he sort of plays both sides of the fence. I think Icke himself is a much better exemplar of this. Because Icke is like, yeah, this is absolutely real. Everything Sitchin says is right, and it's like, and look the fuck out because these people are all after us. You understand what I'm saying? It's like, I think he's a better example of this. I mean, he's sort of picking up where William Bramley, aka Tor Dalin, when he took the Sitchin material and produce Gods of Eden, where it's like, yeah, everything Sitchin's saying is right, and that's our problem. You know what I'm saying? So it's like that to me is a very effective avenue of anti-messaging, and that's why you see when you enter into Anunnaki on YouTube, you get hundreds of thousands of hits, which just it absolutely boggles my mind because that shows, everything, everybody talks about, oh, this is going to go mainstream. This is going to go mainstream. There is no mainstream anymore. There are, just this sort of like this network of capillaries, all sort of operating in this parallel fashion. There is no mainstream anymore. When you see people saying, "Oh, I'm resisting mainstream society," they're resisting nothing because there is no mainstream. We don't have just 3 channels of television and 10 channels of radio, and your daily newspapers. I mean, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of websites and podcasts and things like that, and everything now has to be micro marketed. And that's why, getting back to what we were talking about with this film and how it just seems to be overly committed, that is sort of a result of how difficult it is to mass market. In order to make your money back on these huge tentpole films, you have to appeal to a greater slice of the audience as you possibly can manage. And at the same time, you have to make sure that you're not offending them. You're not offending all these various tributaries that run parallel to what was once the mainstream. It's like you have to make sure that you're not offending them. And I think that's why, in that regard, like Ridley, not Whitley, Ridley was told, listen, we got a lot of negative feedback on this stuff, play it down. But at the same time, it's obviously still there. I mean, in the the story itself. I mean, we do see the whole thing with the engineers, but
all right, so let's
it's not.
Go on.
I just wanted to say it's again, the Brookings report was written back when you had a genuine mainstream and very small clusters of dissidents against the mainstream, but they were, incredibly marginal and incredibly ineffective. I'm sure at some point in time that somebody else has written an update to that report, at least that passage in the report that deals with the whole alien contact issue. I'm sure there have been papers written that just haven't been published.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's last question that actually ties it back in quite well. I still think people should see Covenant, but I like the alien films and I'm easily amused. But final question is, let's talk about some good AAT sci-fi films as recommendations, Mr. Knowles. What are ones that people out there, if they haven't seen, they should see?
Oh, well, obviously 2001: A Space Odyssey is the 800-pound gorilla here. I think that is the probably still the best.
And if you watch that, you need to unpack. Like if you're unsure as to why you need to watch that, watch it and then go and watch some of the documentaries. Maybe they overstate their case somewhat, but a couple of the more recent documentaries in the last 10 years about 2001, and then you'll see what Chris is talking about.
Yeah, and also Quatermass in the Pit, aka 5 Million Miles to Earth. You'll see it listed under both titles. I think that still stands head and shoulders over anything that's been done since. And it's interesting that you had these two films that seemed to come very early on in the program and really set the standard for everything that came since. But also, if you get a chance to watch the full miniseries, the full BBC miniseries of Quatermass in the Pit, which was actually produced in the late, it was produced just before the Brookings report was published, which is, kind of fascinating to me, because it seems to me that somebody, in the British Home Office was a little bit ahead of the curve here, and then it sort of filtered out to the Americans. But that is an incredible piece of work. It still stands up today. I mean, it's in black and white, and the production values are pretty low, comparative, certainly to Alien Covenant. But it is an amazing piece of work. Great writing, and it's interesting too because that's Nigel Neal, who sort of came up in the system. And then also, obviously, the original storyline for 2001: A Space Odyssey was an Arthur C. Clarke short story called The Sentinel. So it's interesting to me that it seems to, there seems to be like a paper trail here. There seems to be like, footsteps that you can sort of follow back to the source. And I think that, somebody in the British establishment was thinking seriously about these things, because sort of a prototype of this whole worldview or this whole thesis is Childhood's End. He sort of jumbles the timeline a bit by saying these ancient fables of devils and things like that were some sort of premonition of a future contact, but it still ties into the same idea. But it also ties into the same idea of the devil as the mankind's creator in a sense, as it's an interesting subset of this whole sort of worldview, because this is how that whole devil as creator storyline shows up in a Doctor Who AAT storyline, but it also shows up in a Star Trek: The Next Generation storyline. So it's interesting that there are sort of variations on these themes, and that almost seems to be I don't know, I guess that would tie back to the Prometheus legends and the Prometheus connections to Lucifer and whatnot. But it seems to be like a very interesting sort of subset of this type. But I think the two best films again are 2001 and Quatermass in the Pit. I also think it's got a lot of problems, as far as storytelling. But the first Stargate film is kind of interesting too.
Yeah, that's true.
I don't know if I'd necessarily recommend it, but I'm sure a lot of people, a lot of your listeners have already seen it. But it seems to be that this is played out, and also The Fifth Element is another example of this. But it seems to me like television has explored this, and maybe because they have more room to than a movie. But there's been obviously like the Stargate series. There's been a few of those. Star Trek, X-Files, things like that. It seems to be like a better venue for this kind of story. But
nice. Well, there's two there, and I guess we could put the X-Files movies in there as well.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't. Well, it's only in the first X-Files movie.
Yeah.
I have some problems with that. It's interesting to me because one of the things I was sort of struck by watching Alien Covenant is that you see every dollar on the screen. You really do. It just kind of blew me away, like the attention to detail in constructing all these control panels and machinery and vehicles and all this sort of thing. They really go to town on it. But that's the whole Hollywood maxim of more is more. And I think, it's interesting if you sort of look back and the X-Files phenomenon, the feature film sort of broke the spell because it took it out of that intimate, where everything is implied, everything is suggested, nothing is really explicit, into like, okay, you're in a giant spaceship underneath the Antarctic. It's like it broke the spell because it took away that sense of intimacy. And I think the first Alien movie has a much better sense of intimacy, and you feel the story more because it's not drawn in such huge, broad strokes. You understand what I'm saying? So I still think that original Alien film is one of the best science fiction films ever made. And it's interesting because really what it is it's basically a slasher movie, but it works on so many different levels.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, Chris, this has been fantastic, and you definitely need no introduction, which is good because the introduction was 90 minutes ago. But people who want to know more, and in particular because you're writing some stuff about Alien Covenant at the moment, what do they do? Where do they go?
Just go to secretsun.blogspot.com, and I write better than I talk because I literally don't talk most of the day. I don't have anybody to talk to. I sit in the room by myself and I read and I write. So I'm much more literate than I am articulate. So
there you go. So weekly podcasts are my speech therapy because otherwise I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah. It's the freelancing life. It's very isolating.
Yeah. Well, sir, the freelancing life calls. So thank you very much, and always a pleasure.
Oh, my pleasure. Exactly.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you simultaneously spoil and unspoil a film. If you're new to this topic and your interest is piqued, get yourself over to the Secret Sun and spend a few hours going through the archives. For more from Rune Soup, subscribe to the show on YouTube or in your favourite podcatcher. And if you're interested in supporting the show, head over to runesoup.com and become a premium member, which will give you access to many additional hours of audio-video content per month. To get in touch with me, find me on Twitter, where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.